Hello there and welcome to today's video, and in today's video we're going to be replacing the alternator on my air-conditioned model K11 Nissan Micra. The air conditioning element is important because the position of the alternator and the way we take the alternator out and fit the new alternator is different to non-air conditioned models, so just something to be wary of. Obviously, one of the first things to do if you're going to do safety first, which I highly recommend, is to disconnect both battery terminals. What I did was I disconnected negative first and then the positive, and just tucked both terminals out the way so they had no chance of making contact with the battery. Now, I highly recommend the following tools. I would recommend a set of ratchet spanners. I would recommend a set of, they're either called crow's foot or swan neck spanners, but they've got sort of like a ring spanner with like a curve on the end. What I tended to use for today's activities was a set of ratchet spanners which had a flexible end. Now, the first thing to do is to, once you've disconnected the battery, is to disconnect both terminals from the alternator, and those use a 12mm nut, and the other one is a 2-pin socket, if I remember rightly. The next thing to do is to loosen off the tensioner. Now, the tensioner on air-conditioned models for the air conditioning compressor and the alternator is basically a tensioning wheel which is on a threaded bolt, and the tensioner itself is clamped in. You can see the tensioner in the shot here, near the top of the shot, is clamped in with a 17mm nut. You undo that nut and you can then actually undo the tensioner on the 12mm nut on the tensioner bracket, which you can see here, which I'm just sorting out. Now, the tensioner, if you turn the nut as if you're doing up the bolt, that will loosen the tensioner. If you undo the nut, that will tighten the tensioner. Now, what I tried here was actually trying to get the belt off. In fact, the belt is the next item which I need to replace, because this one's been slipping for a while and you can see it's sort of quite worn. So what I actually did was undo the top mount on the alternator, and this would actually be very useful if you have to replace the belt. It's a 14mm nut, bolt rather, which holds the alternator to the top bracket. Now, you saw what I focused on there was a 10mm nut which has got this earth wire attached to it. You can see the earth wire coming over the top of the engine mount there. And just so you've got a bit of extra workspace, I highly recommend getting that wire out of the way. As you can see here, it could get caught, and when you're doing a lot of work in this area, it is best to get that out of the way, and it just gives you a bit more freedom to work on the alternator itself. If you're just replacing the belt, what you can do is you can remove that top bolt, undo the tensioner, drop the alternator backwards. Obviously you'll have to disconnect the wiring on it first as well, but you can drop the alternator, I guess it would be towards you if you stood at the front of the car, and that's enough to actually let the belt come off of the alternator and get it off. It goes around the crank pulley, then around the air conditioning compressor, and then underneath the tensioner unit. Obviously around the alternator, then underneath that tensioner wheel. And it's just sort of worth loosening this top bolt as I'm doing here. It just makes getting the belt on and off a heck of a lot easier, and you can turn the job of actually replacing that belt into literally a 5-minute job, and if you've got the right tools you can even do it at the roadside, so it's not exactly difficult. One thing I noticed was that the tensioner itself, when you actually get the belt into the position you've got the alternator belted in, the belt is actually already under tension, and when I went to tighten the tensioner up, all I did was I tightened it so screwing anti-clockwise as if you're loosening, which tightens the tensioner, and you just have to do it a smidge over hand tight. You don't have to actually sort of ramp it down with a ratchet or anything, because it's already in a state where it's going to be under tension. As soon as you put the alternator in a position where it's mounted onto the top mount, the belt is already under a certain degree of tension. Just getting that tensioner tightened up a little bit just puts it under enough tension so it doesn't sort of fly off under high RPM. So what I found was I did it just over hand tight, and then I locked down the 17mm nut on the tensioner wheel itself, and I've got to be honest, that was enough to keep the belt on there and to keep the belt tensioned. Now what I'm doing here is I'm using this ratchet spanner to undo the 14mm bottom bolts. Both these will need to be undone, both will need to come out. If you don't take them out, you can't get the alternator off. Now you'll see just above the alternator in prominent display in the picture here, there is the top bracket for the alternator, and that bolts directly onto the cylinder head. Now there are two 12mm nuts, two 12mm bolts holding this on. As I discovered a little later in the video, and I should have realised this from the last time I changed this alternator, you need to get that bracket out of the way. So the two bolts will come out easily enough, and you'll be able to get the bracket out of the way, just sort of loop it over onto the top of the cam cover, and then that will enable you to wriggle the alternator free. I'm not going to lie, it is a bit of a pain getting the alternator out, but it does come out eventually. You just have to be a little bit patient, and you just have to push one of the AC pipes. In fact, that one there you can see in the frame here. You have to push one of the AC pipes just a little out of the way, just to get it all sorted out and out the way. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm just removing that earth bolt and earth wire that I was mentioning earlier, just to get that out of the way, because you want to try and get anything that will snag out of the way, just so that you're not in a situation where you sort of end up breaking or snapping a wire or anything like that, which would be a little bit of a nightmare, to be honest. Not the end of the world, you could repair it, but it's just easier to get things out of the way. So what we're doing at the moment is we've just sort of done a bit of deck clearing, and we've got the alternator laid back, and it did take a little while to actually get both of those 14mm bolts out. There's not a lot of space to work with, so it's just going to be a lot of ratcheting with your ratchet spanner just to get both of those bolts free. I'm not going to lie, it took this job from start to finish took me about 90 minutes or so, and that's not including the test drive and the final check of the voltage to make sure that everything with the new alternator or replacement alternator was okay. Little bit about the alternator actually. This is going to be the third alternator this car has had. The first one expired due to dodgy bearings, so I bought a second-hand item, and I also bought a refurbed item. Turns out the refurbed item had a 10mm pulley instead of a 100mm pulley instead of a 50mm pulley, which is what this one is here. So I took my old alternator and the new refurbed alternator to my local garage and said, could you whiz off these pulleys and swap them over? Unfortunately, what happened was it turned out that the pulley, the shaft, was thinner on the new alternator. So my pulley would not fit onto the new alternator spindle. So what I've had to do for now is I've had to buy another second-hand known working alternator and fit that to the car just as a sort of get me through for the moment, so I can actually take the alternator I've taken off, which seems to spin freely but just has the voltage regulator problem, and hopefully get that refurbished. It just gives me a little bit of extra time and allows me to keep the car mobile. It's not really going anywhere this winter because obviously we're in the winter and I'm trying to keep it off salted roads as much as possible, with it being a an emerging classic, let's say, and also is sort of low mileage. And I've got another car that I use for sort of work, business trips, etc. But it just gives me a little bit of time to sort of get that sorted out and do a couple of other little bits and pieces that I want to do to it. So you can see I'm moving that bracket out the way, and hopefully in a second, if I'm at the point of the video that I think we're in, yep, here we go. So you can see that aircon pipe is in the way there, and you've got to find a happy medium of tilting the alternator and trying to get it out. You may actually find, when I was watching this video back, the headlight bulb is actually in the way, the connector. You may actually find if you either pop the headlight out or remove that connector and bulb, if you get those out of the way, it may give you just a little bit of extra space to be able to get the alternator out. It didn't take me too long to do it, to be honest. Once I sort of found the knack of it, of doing it this way, dropping it down, tilting it upwards, so pulley is sort of going upwards, a little bit of a wriggle here and there, and you can see it sort of trying to pop out. It's sort of currently caught on the slam panel. And hopefully that should be coming out shortly. So here we go. It is pressing against that aircon pipe, and I was worried I'd rupture something. I was really sort of quite worried about that, but thankfully, touch wood, it was okay. And there it is. It's out. So I actually noticed a bit of green dye around the fill port, which, or that sort of charge port rather, which I think is from when I had it refilled. So these bolts, that top one is for the top bracket on the alternator, and those two longer ones are those 14mm that go at the bottom. So now we're moving on to with the alternator, which has been refitted. I didn't film the refit because I just wanted to get it done, but it's effectively removal is refitting is reversal of removal. So we've got the car set up and ready to go. We've got the multimeter in place, and we measured the voltage across the battery first, and it was about 12.2 volts, so the battery's got plenty of charge in it. So we're now going to start up the engine. You can see my nice green dash there, which is off a pre-facelift SI model, I think, if I remember rightly. Or a pre-2000 facelift, that is. What I always do is I always open the window a little bit. So if you, and this has happened to me before, you get the keys trapped in the car, you don't have to break in to get it out. Anyway, you can see at the moment the car is nice 14.5 volts, and when revving, we're staying at 14.5 volts. Now, that's a good sign. That means that everything is working as it should, and the alternator is not overcharging or anything of that nature. What I did after this little clip here was taken was I turned on the air conditioning, took the car for a quick run, and that just gives me a chance to sort of circulate the air conditioning. On return, I took a check of the voltage again, still 14.5 volts, and obviously revved the car again, still 14.5 volts, so after a journey it was absolutely fine. Also checked the air conditioning. The pipes were covered in moisture, which is a good sign, means the air conditioning is fine, there's no leaks, etc. Anyway, I've gone on a little bit over the outro sequence, so thank you very much for watching. If you have found this video interesting, hit that like button, and also consider subscribing for more upcoming fascinating hobbies. Thank you very much for watching.